Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and welcome to the Z690 Motherboard Roundup. I will not be covering ITX motherboards. We will be covering ATX and like standard 4DIMM motherboards, which these days includes a bunch of ATX designs. Then also MATX motherboards, and then finally extreme overclocking motherboards. And criteria for getting into the list is pretty simple. Basically, I like postcodes, I like VRMs, I like USB ports, I like PCIe slots, and I don't like high prices. So there is a hell of a lot of Z690 motherboards that didn't make it into the list simply because they were way too damn expensive for the functionality that they offered. So if you're wondering why a motherboard isn't in the list, well, if you check the price tag and it's higher than $500, that's a big part of it. So yeah, anyway, let's get into it. Starting off with the Msi Pro Z690-a, and this board comes in a variety of different configurations. You can get it with DDR4 or DDR5, with Wi-Fi or without Wi-Fi, and it costs between like $210 to $250 depending on which configuration you get. The cheapest is obviously the DDR4 without the Wi-Fi. The most expensive is the DDR5 with the Wi-Fi. And honestly, this motherboard is kind of the proof that a lot of Z690 motherboards are incredibly overpriced, because this board already does pretty much everything a Z690, has all of the main functionality you can get out of a Z690 motherboard. So the VRM on this is a 14 power, you've got a 14 power stage V-core. So assuming you have decent airflow around the CPU socket area, this will power even a 12900K without having any issues, because fun fact, 12th gen CPUs, they might be more modern, and the motherboards high-end motherboards might have more power stages than ever before, but the 12th gen chips don't pull any more power than 11th gen or 10th gen did. In fact, if you turn off the E-cores, the 12900K with just the P-cores pulls less power than an 11900K did, while delivering still significantly more performance. So, I really don't see the point of a lot of the motherboards I really don't see the point of the incredibly expensive motherboards with the massively overkill power delivery systems, because it's last I checked, these aren't Threadripper boards. I don't know why we have HEDT level power delivery on them. Straight up doesn't make any sense. But anyway, so this right here is already more than enough to power a 12900K, assuming that, you have halfway decent case airflow. It's got troubleshooting LEDs, you've got 4 M.2 slots, you've got 6 SATA ports, and in the rear I/O, you've got 7 USB Type-A ports, 2.5 gig LAN, a PS2 port, USB Type-C, BIOS flashback functionality, so you can update the BIOS of the motherboard without even having a CPU installed. This does basically everything, right? You can get it with if you want Wi-Fi, well, you can get it with Wi-Fi. You can get it with DDR5 support. This board really sort of goes one so why would you spend significantly more than this? Because it also comes with a 6-layer PCB. This is not, yes, this is the cheapest one of the cheapest Z690 motherboards there is, but in terms of feature set, it basically maxes out the capabilities of the Z690 platform, right? From here on out, basically you get steadily more and more overkill VRMs, and you get one more M.2 slot at best, because there's just not enough PCIe lanes for more than that. And you might get X8 support instead of just X16 support for your Gen 5 slots. And that's it. That is actually it, because Z690 is not an HEDT platform. There is simply not enough lanes to do much more than that. So, if you're considering doing a Z690 build, I would highly recommend considering one of these boards for either the Z690-a DDR4 or the Z690, whichever variant of this board you think is, matches your requirements in terms of functionality, because it's sort of all this is kind of it, right? It already does everything. You want 4 M.2 drives and you want 4 M.2 drives, a 12900K, and whatever GPU you can find. This will run that. This will run that. It won't have issues with that. So there really isn't much reason to go for some crazy expensive Z690 motherboard, because already at the $200 to $250 price point, you have a very, very solid option in the form of the Msi Pro Z690-a, be that the DDR4 variant or the DDR5 variant. So anyway, let's move on to the next board. And this is literally the definition of a very incremental upgrade. So in the rear I/O, we get more USB ports. Okay, cool. And this is the Z690 Aorus Pro from Gigabyte. So in the rear I/O, yeah, you get more USB ports, which obviously I'm a big fan of that. But internally, you still only get 4 M.2 slots. You don't get any more M.2 slots. You get a postcode, which I'm a big fan of. Like, that's the main reason this motherboard is on the list, is because I really like having a postcode on the motherboard, and this comes with one. So naturally, it made it into the list. The VRM on this is actually completely overkill for any CPU that you can put into the socket. So, where this was like, okay, you might need to maybe consider how the air flows through your case. With this, you can just kind of ignore that. It's not going to have any issues. Yeah, because this is 16 phases of 90 amp smart power stages, and you get this at $330. So unless you need like dual X8 PCIe support, that's the thing, is like, if you don't want the postcode and you don't care about the extra USB ports, you can literally go back down to the Pro Z690-a, right? Because like, it's a motherboard. It's basically a very fancy cable. Right? And low-end motherboards, like, the thing is, like, a $220, say, like, Z390 motherboard is way worse than this in terms of power delivery and, well, actually, mostly just the power delivery. Because, well, technically also you'd have less M.2 slots and that kind of thing, but that's not really the Z390 motherboard's fault. That's like the chipset's fault, that there's just not enough PCIe lanes for that kind of thing. So yeah, anyway, but if you want something more overclocking focused, then the Z690 Aorus Pro is literally the cheapest motherboard with a postcode, and there's a DDR5 and a DDR4 variant of this motherboard. However, I will warn you that from what I've heard, I've not yet used a Gigabyte DDR4 motherboard myself, but from what I've heard, Gigabyte's DDR4 support currently is really bad. So you might be better off getting like a like this instead, because if the postcode is telling you, hey, I'm not posting, but you can't fix the reason that it's not posting, you may as well not have the postcode, and that's why you would drop down to, say, like Pro Z690-a DDR4 instead, unless of course you maybe needed the ton of USB ports. But like, at that point we're getting into really nitpicky motherboard choices, and that's not the point of a highlights list, in my opinion. But, yeah, anyway, moving on, we get the MSI Z690 Carbon and Z690 Force. These boards go for around $400, and these totally max out the connectivity of the CPU and the chipset. You get 5 M.2 slots and 2 X8 Gen 5 support, like dual X8 Gen 5 support. So theoretically, you could have a GPU and 7 M.2 drives connected to this motherboard. Yeah, 7, because you can put 2 M.2 drives onto that bottom X8 slot. For the rear I/O, you get a solid number of USB ports, as well as a 2.5 gig, 2.5 gig LAN, BIOS flashback button, Wi-Fi 6. Of course, it's a $400 board. What did you expect? Not get Wi-Fi? Are you insane? You also get a postcode internal, you get a postcode, and the VRM is 18 phases of 75 amp power stages. So again, totally overkill for anything that you can put into the socket, and you don't have to worry about VRM thermals either. So that's kind of the thing. It's just like, and honestly, this is probably like, I wouldn't even necessarily get up to this point. Well, for my personal build, actually, yes, because I do want 2 PCIe slots connected directly to the CPU for my personal build because of the capture card and that kind of thing. But, if you don't have a capture card or anything like that, this exists. You can pay like half as much for basically the same functionality. Or at least like most of the functionality, because this does admittedly have one more M.2 slot, but I don't know how useful you're going to find that. And you can technically convert your PCIe slots into M.2 slots, with the appropriate adapter. So you might be able to actually get the same number of M.2 drives connected to this board for less money than with this board. So, something to keep in mind. Anyway, up next we get sort of side-grady, weird connectivity option motherboards that are, in the $400 to $500 price range. So first up we have the Z690 Aero D. And so this, you lose some of the internal M.2 slots. Instead of having, 5 that we saw on the previous MSI board, you get only 4 M.2 slots internally, but you do still get the dual X8 Gen 5 support. You also you do still get a postcode. The VRM is basically the same thing that you had on the Z690 Aorus Pro, except now the motherboard has 8 layers instead of 6 for the PCB. And in the rear I/O, you get 10 gig LAN, 2.5 gig LAN, and Thunderbolt 4 with display pass-through, as well as, of course, Wi-Fi 6 and not that many USB Type A ports, but all of the other Thunderbolt motherboard in this price range is actually sort of the same, except it's missing a postcode, which I think at this price point, not having a postcode is downright offensive. Yeah. So that's the Z690 Aero D from Gigabyte. I don't know what the price for this is yet, but it should be somewhere between $400 and $500 because in terms of other than the 10 gig LAN, in terms of functionality, it's very similar to this while having the VRM from here. So yeah, I can't imagine this would be too expensive. Yeah, and also the Aero boards generally seem to be priced somewhat usually either the same as the Master or slightly below the Master. So yeah, speaking of the Master, here's the Master. So let's say you don't care about dual X8 support, but you do want 10 gig LAN. Well, that's basically what this does. You get 10 gig LAN in the rear I/O, you get more USB Type A ports, you lose the Thunderbolt though, and you get a mega overkill VRM. This super 19 power stages, with the Tantalum polymer capacitors for better transient response. Not that that seems to be much of an issue on Z690 in general. The socket seems to have improved in terms of power delivery capabilities quite significantly. So, yeah. And then internally you get 5 M.2 slots. So we're back up to the same number of M.2 slots that you got on the Carbon, except in return, except as a trade-off, you lose the dual X8 support, which... yeah, it's kind of my biggest complaint for this board is just I would have really wanted the dual X8 support, but Gen 5 switches are actually really expensive, and so this motherboard at $470, depending on what kind of connectors you're looking for, yeah, this exists. It's kind of the point. If you don't want 10 gig LAN, you don't have to buy this, because that's sort of the main highlight feature with this motherboard as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, moving on to the last ATX motherboard, we have the Msi Z690 Unify, and this gives us another different mix of features for, between $400 and $500. So you get dual X8 support, you get the 5 M.2 slots, you also get dual BIOS functionality on this motherboard, which is pretty cool, as well as other overclocking features like Safe Boot and LN2 mode. And then in the rear I/O, you have dual 2.5 gig LAN. You also get a PS2 port as well as a bunch of USB Type A ports. So, yeah, this is the thing. So in the sort of $400 to $500 price range, you have a lot of options depending on what exactly you want in terms of connectors. And if you don't care for any of these advanced connectivity options, you can just go buy a Z690A Pro. I am entirely serious about that. It really doesn't make sense to spend... you're not going to notice a massive performance difference between especially if you're doing manual, if you manually overclock it yourself, you are not going to see some crazy difference between a, $220 motherboard and a $800 motherboard. You just won't. You're at ambient. The CPUs have a brick wall in terms of voltage behavior, and the memory overclocking, admittedly for DDR5, the 6-layer boards are probably slightly weaker than the 8-layer boards, but, there's going to be a couple hundred mega transfers per second. It's not really going to be the end of the world. So, yeah, that's why the list, and incidentally, all of the, this is an 8-layer PCB, this is an 8-layer PCB, this is an 8-layer PCB, this is also an 8-layer PCB. So, if you just want the memory overclocking, you can get basically any of these in the $400 to $500 price range, and you've got that. So, yeah, and I'm fully aware that there's a bunch of Z690 motherboards that are at even higher prices than this, and I spent a very long time looking at them and thinking about why on earth I should recommend that you go out and spend $600 on a motherboard that, isn't gonna make a difference. It just won't. So, yeah. Anyway, that's the sort of normal, 4DIMM ATX and eATX boards. This is an eATX. You can see it's a bit too wide. Same goes for the Aero D. This is also a bit too wide. This is an interesting board in that it's this weird mishmash of the Aorus Pro with the Aorus Master. But anyway, yeah. So that's the ATX boards. And like, again, I highly recommend that you first consider this. If you want a lot of connectors, then there's obviously the MSI Carbon. If you mostly just want a postcode, then there's the Pro. Then if you want like weird combinations of like 10 gig and maybe like dual LAN or X8 slots and, whatever, you have the, the Aero D, the Master, and the Unify to consider for that. And so yeah, that's the ATX board. Let's move on to the MATX. And for MATX, you don't have very many options, which makes it super simple because you've got the Asus Prime Z690M Plus D4. This is a $140 motherboard. You get 3 M.2 slots because there's simply not enough space to have more than that in on the board itself. It's got a 10+1 phase VRM so 10 phase V-core, or actually it's probably not a 10 phase. This is a low-end Asus motherboard. It's probably a 5 phase, but you got 10 power stages for V-core. You're gonna have, like, this is the same scenario. Actually, this is a worse scenario than with the Z690-a from MSI. You're gonna need to give this heatsink some airflow if you're gonna be really pushing a 12900K, but a fan is significantly cheaper than the price jump between this to this, right? So Z690-G, this is a $350 MATX motherboard. It's like the only high-end MATX option for Z690 currently, probably forever. Unfortunately, the MATX form factor has been just completely neglected by the industry, and I don't blame them for it. Let's be realistic. An MATX board is barely shorter than an ATX board. Like, it's 3 PCIe. Like, the difference between this and this is 3 PCIe slots, right? In terms of height, which is just not that much. And anyway, you do get a decent number of USB ports on the Z690M Plus D4. And so really the only reason, like, you don't get any troubleshooting LEDs, which I find really annoying. Like, yes, it's a $190 motherboard, but like even the cheapest of Z690 ASRock boards, which I wouldn't even touch with a 10-foot pole, that still has troubleshooting LEDs, So when it catches on fire, it'll tell you about it. Yeah, like this thing right here, like, if you just want basic functionality and you're not going to be doing a ton of overclocking, then this has you covered. If you'd like to have some, visual indication of what's going on with the post process, then the Z690G also gives you a much better VRM, right? This is on 14 power stages, so we're up to the same number of power stages that you get on the Z690-a from MSI, except at like a 50% higher price tag. This is fine. Welcome to Z690 motherboards. It does have an 8-layer PCB, though. Like, that is worth noting. This does have an 8-layer PCB. But, yeah, so, you get troubleshooting LEDs, you get more layers. The memory overclocking doesn't seem to be as good as some of the 6-layer boards from Asus, so I'm suspecting that this topology is some unique thing for this motherboard, and so might not be that great in the end. But for MATX, there's really not that many options. And in terms of rear I/O functionality, like, it's well equipped, right? You've got clear CMOS in the back, BIOS flashback functionality, 2.5 gig LAN, 8 USB Type A ports, dual Type Cs, Wi-Fi 6, of course. You get display outputs as well. The VRM heatsinks are substantial, and the VRM is also, like, at 14+1 power, like, with 14 power stages for V-Core, like, this will be fine for any CPU you can fit into the socket. You get 3 M.2 slots on the board because it's an MATX. There's not enough space for more than that. And, yeah, like, the only downside to this motherboard, in my opinion, is that it's, like, more expensive than an Aorus Pro, and it doesn't even have a postcode. So, yeah, so, but this does exist. So if you're looking for, like, a high-end MATX option, this is the only option. So I figured I'd point that out. And honestly, it's like, I don't think it'll be a bad motherboard. I just think it costs too much. Though at the same time, considering that MATX generally has issues with, like the whole reason that MATX is neglected is because people don't buy enough MATX motherboards to justify making high-end MATX motherboards. I would assume part of the price tag here is the fact that they don't expect to make too many of these. So, yeah. Anyway, moving on, we get to the extreme overclocking boards, which we're going to start with the Maximus Z690 Apex. This board is very, very expensive. However, unlike basically the entire rest of the Asus motherboard lineup, I can tolerate the price tag on this. I'm not happy about it, but I can tolerate it because this thing is so freaking awesome. So this board is $720. Yeah, but we've got SP caps for the output filtering of the V-Core VRM. and it does seem to be the 3-terminal SP caps. So these are literally the best kind of polymer capacitor you could possibly have for output filtering of anything, really. Or at least for like V-core output filtering. Like, it doesn't get better than this. You get a huge postcode, which I'm a big fan of. Like, that's a abnormally large postcode readout, which is just cool. Like, it makes it even easier. Like, it makes it easier to read. Board obviously has dual BIOS functionality. There's now BCLK up-down buttons, which is something I never thought I'd see on an Asus motherboard. Like, that's not a feature that they've ever had on a built into a motherboard. They've always had like some kind of weird dongle thing to get that functionality, but now it's just built into the board. So that's really cool. You get all of the like LN2 overclocking, like LN2 mode, RSVD switches, safe boot functionality, retry button, voltage read points. They put the 6-pin power connector for extra PCIe slot power into a reasonable location. Like, honestly, if it wasn't so damn expensive, this would still be a really cool daily motherboard, right? Because you've got plenty of USB Type-A ports, like the full-blown PS2 ports for both your mouse and keyboard separately, so that's cool. Wi-Fi 6, of course, 2.5 gig LAN, clear CMOS button, BIOS flashback. Like, this is perfect. This is literally, as far as I'm concerned, this is the perfection, motherboard perfection, except for the price. The $720 is a lot. This is a very, very expensive motherboard. But on the other hand, those are very expensive. Like, the thing is, like, they did put 24 power stages into the V-Core VRM. It's a 12-phase. And they've got, and those are 105 amp smart power stages. So it's like they've got the most expensive power stages. They've got way too many of them. Honestly, if they cut half the VRM off of this board, I wouldn't actually have a problem with it. Like, 12th gen really isn't that power hungry, but yeah, like, I don't think that would have done enough to get the motherboard under like the 700. Well, it would have probably got it down to the $600 mark. I don't think it would have gotten it under $500. Also, I believe this is the first time the Apex has been on an 8-layer PCB other than the X299 Apex. And so yeah, this is the one motherboard in the Asus Z690 lineup where I'm willing to tolerate the price tag, because it's just like, it's so freaking awesome. This is the best Apex they've put out so far, and it's like huge upgrades compared to its predecessors, though I kind of wish that now they would make an Apex Lite, where, they made a cheaper variant of this, because I think like $720 is just kind of an insane price tag for a motherboard. Actually, it's not even kind of, it just is an insane price tag for a motherboard. Like, this is a really cool motherboard, but at it's just so damn expensive. And also, it's worth noting that a lot of the things that I do so like about this board are not present on the vast majority of the Asus Z690 lineup, okay? So this gets into the list because this is actually a really special board, whereas the rest of the Z690 lineup from Asus isn't. You may have noticed that, like, it's, they're not in the list basically at all until the MATX boards. It's because the rest of the lineup is pretty generic Asus motherboards at higher price tags than ever before. So, nope, not those. But this is cool. This is really cool. This thing is like, there's a very high chance that I'm going to end up buying this because it's just so freaking awesome. Anyway, next up, we've got the EVGA Z690 Dark, which basically seems to be an updated version of the Z590 Dark, as in new socket, new VRM design. Actually, they're probably going to use the same VRM, because again, like, you don't actually need more power delivery. What the Apex is doing here is just completely excessive. Yeah, this, on the other hand, like, the main thing with the dark boards is just kind of like EVGA's BIOS is really nice to work with, and also if you have the memory that the dark is optimized for, it works really well. But you have to have, like, that's the one trade-off with the dark boards in my experience, is just like, they are, like, for Z590, the Z590 Dark is incredible with Samsung B-Die, and with DJR it's just kind of eh, and with Micron it's kind of eh, but with B-Die for Z590 it's straight up the best B-Die motherboard I've used, but for, like, other memory chips it's just kind of, like, it's not bad, it's just also not that special. So It'll be interesting to see which memory chips the Z690 Dark will be optimized for. I'm guessing Hynix, because right now Hynix is in the lead for like performance DDR5 memory chips, but yeah, we're gonna see. Anyway, next up we've got the Z690 Aorus Tachyon, which this should be cheaper than the other two. So this is $720. This is probably going to be around $750 because, you know, like the 10-layer PCB. Also, the darks have just historically been very expensive. The Z690 Tachyon, I imagine this will be around $600 probably, maybe lower than that. I would really, like, if they could squeeze this in at $500, I think that would be amazing. But yeah, we'll see. I have no idea what the current pricing plan for the Tachyon is. But this board, obviously, like, this is very similar in a lot of ways to the Apex, except the VRM isn't as insane, right? We've just got a 15 phase, which is a real phase count, by the way. Like, the RAA controller, like the 229131, it'll do that. It'll do that just fine. It'll go all the way up to 19, actually 20 phases, right? Like, the Aorus Master, this is a 19 phase, and that's, again, thanks to that RAA 2291 voltage controller. Anyway, we have tantalum polymer capacitors for the output filtering, which, like, these are better than through-hole capacitors, but they are not better than 3-terminal SP caps. Like, I'm just... These are also insanely expensive, by the way. Like, these... Like, tantalum polymers are already more expensive than your through-hole capacitors. These, on the other hand, are ridiculous in terms of price. Like, these are very, very, very expensive. So, you know... yeah, at the same time, I do wonder if it'll actually make much of a difference in terms of voltage regulation. As there's typically with motherboards, or just with power delivery in general, there's a point of diminishing returns. And once you hit that, you know, making the voltage regulation any better becomes very, very difficult, if not borderline impossible, because at some point it's no longer about what's physically on the board, it's about what's physically, like, what's on the actual CPU itself, right? And the motherboard can't really affect that side of the equation. But yeah, like, so this, like, this, like, if the Apex came with this VRM, I'd have no problem with it, right? If it's just that the Apex just went massive overkill, just absolutely massive overkill is the best way to describe what they did on what Asus did with the Apex. So the Tachyon takes a more sensible approach to its power delivery. And then in terms of functionality, though, it's very, very similar. You've got your dual BIOS, you've got LN2 mode, slow mode, limp mode, so that's Gigabyte's version of safe boot. You've got the retry button, reset button, power button, ratio up down, BCLK up down. And I will say, like, you know, with this board you get to choose if it's ratio up down or BCLK up down, whereas with the Asus board it's only BCLK. I think that's a very minor difference, right? Like, usually you'd be changing the ratio with software anyway, so that I don't consider a huge advantage in either direction. In terms of PCIe slot configuration, they're both the same. So really, I'd say, like, choosing between the Apex and the Tachyon, it's more about, like, whose BIOS you prefer, more so than really anything else. And personally, like, I want both of them. I'll be honest, I want both of these. Right? Like, the Apex boards, like, I love my Maximus 12 Apex. And this looks so freaking cool. So... yeah, and I should be getting one of these for testing, so... yeah, ultimately, like... man, I don't like making choices between these kinds of boards. And I imagine I guess ultimately it'll come down to, like, which one is easier to... like, which one's less annoying to work with, is usually what it comes down to with motherboards. Speaking of less annoying to work with, the Msi Z690 Unify X. So this is $500, and MSI, I will, like... and personally, I think MSI's BIOS is the best organized. Like, best layout, least renaming of things for no apparent reason. Like, that's a favorite of Asus, is just renaming voltages and stuff, because why would we use standard naming conventions when we can make up names instead? So, yeah. So the Unify X, probably the least annoying in terms of the BIOS. At the same time, you know, the VRM on this is far less fancy, though the funny thing is, I would not be surprised if the voltage regulation performance between all three of these boards was basically the same. Because, you know, like, actually even including the dark, I would not be too surprised if they all performed exactly the same, because that has happened in the past where a variety of very different approaches to the VRM design ended up producing exactly the same performance results. So, yeah, that is something to keep in mind. But this is probably the thing is, this is cheaper than the other two, and so, or more like the other three. This is significantly cheaper, and you still get an 8-layer PCB, 1 DIMM per channel configuration. You get safe boot functionality, you get basically all the same features, right? Dual BIOS as well. Like, feature set wise, this is the same. The big differences here is the PCIe slot layout on this is not going to do, has a different PCIe slot spacing, right? So there's a 4-slot gap on the Tachyon and the Apex, whereas on the Unify it's a 3-slot gap. Actually, no, it's 2 slots, right? Because this is slot 2, 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, so that's 2-slot gap between these. Whereas here you have a 3-slot gap. Yeah, what else is there? That's kind of it. That's the issue with the extreme overclocking motherboards. Is just I really think it comes down to whose BIOS you like best. And then also to some extent whose BIOS is the best optimized for whatever it is that you're doing, right? And so, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how these, extreme overclocking boards compared to each other. Though, I would give MSI the advantage just for being cheaper, right? Like, if I can spend less money to get basically the same results, then I am going to spend less money in a lot of situations. Like, if I was actually yeah. So, that is also something to consider with the extreme overclocking boards. Yeah, so that's it for the Z690 motherboard roundup. Is just like I said, well, actually I didn't say it in this take, but in one of the earlier takes I basically said once we get to the extreme overclocking boards, it'll be basically a case of me going ooh shiny, because these all have everything. Like, these all do everything I would want a motherboard to do. They just have different ways of doing it depending on how how each of the manufacturers implements it. And it's really hard to say if any of them is going to be specifically better. To some extent, a lot of the time, my favorite motherboard comes down to it just doesn't complain so much about doing things, right? Or it's faster to train and that kind of thing. Which is especially the dark is, speaking of memory training, the dark with certain memory chips is so fast, and with other memory chips, not fast at all. So it really just comes down to what exactly you're going to be doing with these. Yeah, so these are too early to judge, but I do love what Asus has done with the VRM of the Apex. This is really cool, even if it costs way too damn much. So anyway, realistically, if you're actually buying a motherboard for a daily system, I would very strongly recommend that you consider one of the variations of this first. And then if you need more connectivity, or if you want a postcode, get this. If you want more connectivity, get this. If you want 10 gig and Thunderbolt, there's this. If you want 10 gig but don't care about Thunderbolt, there's this. And if you want dual X8 PCIe slots and don't care about having Thunderbolt or 10 gig in the back, just want more USB ports, you get this. Or if you want more overclocking functionality than what MSI has on the Force and the Carbon is the better way to put it, because otherwise this is actually very similar to the Force and the Carbon in terms of connectivity. So, yeah. That is the Z690 motherboard roundup. And that's it for the video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, there is the Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description below. There's also the AHOC Teespring store where you can pick up shirts, stickers, posters, the usual YouTuber merch. Both Patreon and Teespring help out immensely with running the channel, so it'd be much appreciated if you check them out. And that's it for the video, so thank you for watching, and goodbye.